Now I get to introduce our next speaker to the stage. His name is Nick Freitas. He is a member, He's a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and he's a Green Beret combat veteran. And now, as a public speaker and a policy expert, he inspires others to engage in the culture and to promote values that will lead to a stronger society. He's one of our favorites at Live Action. He's one of my favorites, and if he is not one of your favorites, he is about to be. Would you please help me welcome Nick Freitas to the stage?
Mr. Speaker, not this time.
All righty. Hey, be quiet. I don't got a lot of time. All right. You don't clap for politicians. It only encourages us. You don't want to do that. First of all, thank you very much for being here. I very sincerely mean that. It's very excited to know. I was already excited when there were 800 people here last year, but the fact that it sold out with 1,500 people this time around is incredibly encouraging. All right, here's the part that's not encouraging. We live in a society where if you support the destruction of innocent human life in its most innocent and most vulnerable stage, you are most likely going to be lauded by the culture as a champion of women's rights, of a champion of equality, of a champion of general freedom. And if you oppose the destruction of innocent human life at its most innocent and vulnerable stages, you're going to be spoken about as if you're some sort of radical, that you're a part of a vicious patriarchy that wants to oppress women and hold them down. And you think about that for a second, and you think about all of the depravity that we've seen without society through history. And I actually struggle to find many other times in human history where I could say that something was as deprived as not only killing babies in the womb, but elevating it as a moral imperative. And yet, that's the society we live in. Now, I used to think that the problem here was that we just didn't give a good enough argument with respect to defining that baby in the womb as innocent human life. If we would just give a better, good faith argument, then we would change people's minds. And the reason why I believe that was because I remember people constantly coming up to me and going, Nick, no, the problem is it's not a baby, it's just a clump of cells. Okay, well now you have issued a statement to me. You've issued me something that I can actually respond to. You have said that the reason why you're okay with abortion is because it's not a baby, it's just a clump of cells. Okay, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you at your word, and I'm going to develop a good, well-researched, logical argument demonstrating that there's no way that what you just said could possibly be true. Because after all, we know from scientific research that at the moment of conception, you have all of the DNA that you will have that makes you you, that makes you individually and uniquely not only human, but you. On top of that, you meet the other scientific criteria that we use to distinguish between life and non-life, human life and non-human life. The other characteristic that is very, very important here is the innocence component. Obviously, as a baby in the womb, they did not put themselves in that situation. They were put there by two other people that made, in most cases, a conscious decision to engage in activities which we all know bring about the creation of innocent human life and the dependency upon that human life on the mother. So if we can clearly articulate the various scientific, moral, legal, logical reasons why what we're talking about is actually innocent human life, well then I'm going to change your mind, right? Because when you told me that your problem is that I believed it was a baby and you believed it was a clump of cells, and now we've established that it is in fact human life, then you're going to change your mind, correct? And yet, 10 years in a legislature, responding to those sorts of arguments, making those sorts of arguments, carrying legislation, I've discovered that we were making good faith arguments to people that had an entirely different motivation. And one of the things I think we need to keep in mind is that you can never underestimate the human capacity to justify the most vile of acts if you've convinced yourself it's in your own best interest. And then where it gets really sickening is when you elevate it to a moral imperative. So whose fault is it? Well, that's easy. It's men's. Because everything's your fault. Everything's your fault. You're too aggressive. You're not aggressive enough. You stepped up to lead too much. You don't step up to lead enough. You called back too quick. You didn't call back fast enough. Everything you do is either an ick, right? Or part of some deep-seated scheme to engage in patriarchal oppression. It is amazing to me that you young men, especially you young men, you guys, from what I've heard, are the dumbest, most incompetent, fat, lazy, stupid individuals on the planet. And yet, you have somehow managed to infiltrate and control every single political, economic, financial, and social institution on the country to benefit you at the oppression of everyone else. That's impressive. Right? That's impressive. Boys, 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 right? But have you ever noticed, I'm going to stick up for the guys here a little bit, ladies, because the guys have been dumped on quite a bit. Have you ever noticed that when you look at the pinnacle, the ideal feminist, empowered woman, what are the qualifications for that? Well, you have to elevate your professional aspirations and career to the detriment of your family. You have to be able to engage in any sort of vice or activity that might have previously been associated by men, but if they can do it, then you should be able to do it too, right, ladies? And ultimately, the final one was that you should be freed from any sort of inhibition or traditional norms regarding sex. Because after all, the guys can go out there and do whatever they want, but the consequences for women were always very, very different until abortion became widespread. Now all of a sudden, they've achieved perfect equality with men. And what is the pinnacle of the feminist woman? A bad man. Because if we see a man that prioritizes their career and professional aspirations to the detriment of their family, if we see a man that engages in any sort of vice or hedonistic exploit, if we see a man that impregnates a woman and then abandons her, we rightfully conclude that's a bad man. And yet, it's now been held up as the standard. How ironic. Now, this is the part where, guys, I am going to come down on our side a little bit here because we need to hear it. I think there's a lot of young men right now that feel like they've been getting a lot of mixed signals on what it is they're supposed to be, the role they're supposed to play, and nowhere has that been more apparent than on the issue of abortion, because you are repeatedly told to sit down and shut up because it's not your issue. And there seems to be this certain degree of plausibility to this, right? You're not the one that is getting pregnant. That's still true even in California. The man is not the one getting pregnant. And so there is an increased vulnerability. In fact, for as much as they want to erase, as much as they want to elevate this kind of hyper-egalitarian sense of the way society is supposed to be, what they actually end up doing in the process is erasing some of the things that are so unique to femininity and womanhood as to erase them as a category completely. The desire for that perverse egalitarian society is used to erase one of the most special and unique things that women can do. And then it's elevated as a burden on them. Because men can't get pregnant and therefore we can do certain things, we must now eradicate pregnancy as a barrier to women seeking and achieving fulfillment, purpose, and meaning. You tell me that there's other civilization throughout history that is engaged in a more perverse twisting of reality than that? And I do believe that part of the reasons why it's grown, part of the reason it's persisted, is because there was a subset of men that when they looked at a movement among women that said, we don't just want equal protection before the law, we want our husbands to stop hitting us, to stop abusing our kids, and to start fulfilling their roles within the household. Because if you look at the era of prohibition, there was a reason why that was going on at that time. And there was a certain subgroup of men, a certain subset of men that looked at those women and said, what if we just let you do it too? I know it's got to be difficult to get these mixed signals, to not understand what's expected of you. But if there's one piece of advice I could give you, and I'm very serious about this, stop listening to what the current society and culture is telling you they want out of you. Because what they want out of you is to destroy you. The reason why they tell you to be quiet on this issue, among so many others, the reason why they want you to be guilty for oppressions or atrocities you never participated in because you weren't even born yet, is because they want to silence you. And they don't want to do that because you're weak. They want to do that because they know how strong and powerful you actually are. Any of you guys seen the podcast Trigonometry? Konstantin Christen? Yeah. So they do this thing at the end of their podcast, which I was not prepared for and didn't know about, where they said, all right, Nick, what's the one thing? We just talked for like an hour and a half. What's the one thing nobody is talking about that we should be? And I thought for a second, I said, well, I'm not going to say nobody's talking about it, but if you're asking me, the big thing that isn't getting enough attention, it's this. Young men are going to revolt. Right? This whole narrative that, again, you're fat, lazy, stupid, oppressors, you're evil, you're all that. And my favorite one is, we don't even need men until there's a fire or a war or your streets need to be policed. And then all of a sudden, those tasks are predominantly performed by young men. It's almost like it's not just a social construct, but maybe a reflection of reality. But you stand in the way. Dr. Morse was talking about that. She is spot on. You go and read about what Karl Marx had to say about the family. You think Karl Marx hated capitalism? Go read some of the things he said about the family. He despised the biblical notion of family. He despised the various roles that were spoken about in that particular area. And they have done their level best to convince women to run away from it, but they have to convince you as men to sit down and shut up for it fully to take effect. But the problem is, it can't. You cannot tell the men that you expect to police your cities, enforce your laws, fight your wars, You cannot tell them to sit down and shut up forever. You cannot continually denigrate them and expect them to not have something to say about it eventually when they recognize a very important fact. And that is, despite all the veneer of civilization or Enlightenment philosophy or everything else, at the end of the day, force matters. And those who can impose force will ultimately have a say in how society is governed. So young men are going to revolt against this. And they should. They should. They should take their proper place within society, within the family. But the other concern I think we need to be paying attention to right now is that just because we may think that it would be appropriate for young men to revolt and to actually once again fully and truly and culturally embrace the biblical definition of what masculinity is supposed to be, that is not the only people competing for their attention. In fact, I would say at this point right now, we have some people giving young men a vision of masculinity, which is every bit as perverse and every bit as denigrating to masculinity as the current options that are being available to them. So what do I mean by that? Well, I love the phrase toxic masculinity because it's essentially how I know I'm winning a debate. If I'm arguing with a leftist and they all of a sudden accuse me of toxic masculinity, I'm like, oh, I'm crushing it. But there are masculine traits, right? There are feminine traits, there are masculine traits. When we talk about masculinity, all we're really discussing is the various traits that we generally associate with men. Competitiveness, sometimes singular focus, sarcasm, aggression, the capability and capacity for violence. Now, are those characteristics, are those traits toxic? It depends on the context. If I use my strength to beat you up and take your wallet, that is a toxic manifestation of aggression and a capacity and capability for violence. If I use my strength to stop the person trying to do that, that is a positive manifestation. So the masculinity is not what's toxic. It's the way it's being directed. Now, part of the problem with the way that I think we have taught young men, and specifically young men in the church, is that in our desire for our churches to be more culturally relevant, we have told young men that what they need to be is nice. How many of you are going to the speed dating event tonight, gentlemen? Okay. Let me help you out with something real quick. Do you know, this is important, do you know why nice guys finish last? Because they should. Christ, the pinnacle for us in our faith, was not a nice guy. He was kind, he was compassionate, he was loving, but he was also intense, intellectual. He was also somebody that would flip over tables and beat you with a whip. You see, here's what's crazy. When I say that, the men are kind of listening and the women are going, yes. No, there's a reason for that. There is a reason for that. All right, if the Christian men are just the nice guys, women will choose barbarians. You laugh, think about this for a second. Regardless of what feminism tries to teach you, men are supposed to be the protectors and the providers. And yet, sometimes I will see young men that have been fed this narrative that all they have to be is moral. Please believe me when I tell you this, young men. Nobody wants to have a baby with or raise a child with a pleasant victim. They don't. It's not attractive. And the reason why it's not attractive is because it's not what you were meant to be. You are meant to be dangerous. Not toward your family, but for them. Not toward your family, but for them. One of the greatest compliments my wife ever gave me was she just stopped me one day. She pulled me aside and she goes, "You make me feel safe." Ladies and gentlemen, I could go on that compliment for another 5 years. Okay? But I will consistently run into young men that are like, well, but Nick, you know, I study in my Bible and I have a good relationship with God and my prayer life is good and I've you know, I can intellectually discuss these things and, you know, I don't sleep around and I don't do these other things. Why can't I find a good wife? And I look at him sometimes, I say, look, I understand that there's problems within culture, but I almost feel like that moment where Jesus is talking to the rich man and he says, yes, you have all of these things, you followed all the law, but this one thing you lack, a decent bench press. Okay? And the reason why I know this is important is not just from my own experience with my wife, but I remember I was raised a Christian. I was raised in a Christian home. I always believed in Christ. I can't remember a time when I didn't, but I can remember a time when it was effectively meaningless for all practical reasons in my life. And it wasn't because I wasn't aware of the truth. But at this stage in my military career, I had gone through infantry school, airborne school, air assault school, sniper school, ranger school, the SF qualification course. I was a Green Beret. I'd been to combat. Like, I felt pretty good about who I was as a man. And yet, there was this component of my life that was missing. And it was this superficial commitment to Christ that had no practical application in the way that I led my family, raised my children, or interacted with my community. So who was it? Was it an incredibly intellectual and articulate theologian that snapped me out of it? Was it somebody that just presented this incredible argument for why I needed to do a better job and actually assume the proper role in leadership as the spiritual head of my household? Was it any of that? You know, I'll tell you what it was. It was three men. One of them was my neighbor, Anthony Brown. One of them was a team leader I had in Special Forces, Ryan Nienaber, and the other gentleman, I can't remember his name because I didn't know him for that long, but we went to a course together, and the impact that he had and his boldness was just really significant. I did not listen to those men because they were adequately or sufficiently moral. I listened to them because I was absolutely positive any one of them can handle themselves in a fight. And we chuckle at that, but I'm serious here. Please understand, I'm not making a joke. I had been opposed. I had been presented with all kinds of very genuinely good Christian men who understood Scripture, who understood all of those roles. But what I was looking for was I could respect as a man in that basic sense of being able to protect. This was a guy that could handle themselves in a firefight. Because that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be the sort of guy that could handle themselves in a firefight. And now all of a sudden I'm reading these guys that it's not an either-or proposition. It's not be a nice, docile Christian man or a warrior. They're supposed to coincide. And these guys exemplified that for me. They earned my respect in a category of masculinity that I admired. And so I wanted to listen to the rest. And I realized that the very thing that made them good Christians also made them better warriors. It made them better protectors. It made them better providers. See, the hedonistic version of what you're being fed right now from certain elements of the internet that say, well, yeah, absolutely, you've been lied to about feminism. You've been dumped on your entire young life. And what you need to do now is you need to be able to develop yourself physically, professionally, socially, so that you can go back and take what is yours. So that you can have the cars, you can have the wealth, and you can have the women. That's what you're being told. And that's a pretty appealing message when there's no other one being presented by anybody you respect or admire. But it becomes utterly absurd the moment you come into contact with a man that has fully embraced all of the duties and responsibilities that God has given him as a husband, as a father. And they've looked at that as a never-ending journey on their life. Anytime they start to feel tired or they start to feel weak, they remember that God has given them a wife to protect and provide for, children to raise, and that gets them up and they work even harder. When the hedonist needs to take a break, the man of God continues on because he understands in whose service he is working for. The question is, are you going to develop those core capabilities in order to fulfill it? It is not good enough to just be moral. Of course you should be moral. It's not good enough to just make good arguments. Of course you should do that. But ladies and gentlemen, we have plenty of people that have been moral and made good arguments, and we still live in a society where you can kill the unborn and be celebrated for doing it. Meanwhile, you are silenced if you speak out against it. That is what happens when Christian men decide that it's more responsible, it's more appropriate to be nice than to actually boldly declare the truth. So here's what I'm going to encourage. And look, it's not that these categories don't apply to women as well, but I get invited to talk to the men, so I'm talking to the men. There's 5 categories that every man should be constantly aspired to. The first is the spiritual, because I can't emphasize this enough. The bedrock upon which you will build your family has to be Christ. Anything else, physical attraction, interests, common goals, all of it will fail you in the moment of crisis. My wife and I both came from broken homes. Both of us came from multiple divorces. We got married at 19 and 20. We had people at our wedding betting on how long it would take for us to get divorced. But there was 2 things that we did right off the bat that made all the difference. One is regardless of our ability to effectively engage in it, we still had that fundamental commitment to Christ in our marriage, that was going to be the bedrock upon which we built it. And it was so strong, and this is a testimony to how much God blesses this, is that even when we weren't living that way, that initial commitment was honored by Christ in our marriage, and it kept it from ever getting to a point where we couldn't recover. But that has to be the bedrock because it forms the basis for objective morality and objective truth. And there are going to be times, no matter how much you love each other, where you fight, where you have disagreements. And the question is to what do you appeal? To whom do you appeal? The second is that we decided very early on that it was her and I, ride or die, forever. And a lot of people now, I think, well, you got lucky. Really? Both of us came from homes with multiple divorces. We got married very young, and then we immediately went into a career field where the divorce rate is incredibly high compared to like society in general, the military. And then we went into wartime. And then I went into special operations, which is even a higher divorce rate. We got lucky? No, we recognized something true about what God was telling us about marriage and relationships. And even when we couldn't perfectly execute it, we recognized that when we fell short, we had failed, not the standard God had set. And so there was always something to strive for. And then that idea, that commitment of, no, it's you and I together forever, that's it. I know that sounds scary at times. I know, especially in a society where we just throw things away the moment it doesn't make us happy, it feels like that's a pretty big commitment. Well, it is. But the reason why you make that commitment is not just because it's morally correct. The reason you make that commitment is because if you actually want to have the kind of family that can make it through all of the trials, can make it through all of the challenges, and come out the other side even stronger and more in love than you were before, you have to start off with that commitment. There's no alternative. So to the men, here's what I'll say. Develop the spiritual. You also got to develop the emotional. What I mean by that is you need to be able to keep your emotions under control. There will be a lot of people now that say, oh, I want a man that can cry. No, they don't. That doesn't mean there aren't appropriate times to cry. I will tell you right now, when I walked my daughter down the aisle, and I gave her away to my son-in-law, who's a great guy, and we did our final daddy-daughter dance, and she played the song Cinderella, because it was the song she had picked for us to dance to at every daddy-daughter dance we'd ever been to. And she told me I had done a good job. I lost my crap. Right? But a man, a biblical man, keeps his emotions under control so that he can be strong in the midst of the storm. You do have to develop yourself intellectual. I don't mean to imply that the intellectual arguments that we make and the understanding that we bring to these issues are not important. They are. They're just not sufficient in and of themselves. You can't just win an argument. You also got to be able to win a fight. And that's where the physical comes in. Guys, get to the gym. Get to the gym. You're going to do this for two reasons. If you take seriously your obligation to protect and provide, all right, protect and provide for your wife, well, then if you're in better shape, you're going to be able to provide better and longer, right? If you're in a fight, you can go more than a couple rounds. And when it comes to loving your wife, you also want to be able to go more than a couple rounds. Right? I'm just saying, guys. Look, Dr. Morse was far more graphic than I was. By the way, I just want to say this, and this is the part where Lila's probably never going to invite me back again. I was on with Matt Fradd a while back on Pints with Aquinas. And we were talking about we were talking about kind of the problems with the culture of sex in America right now, and I was saying, well, you know where it's really bad is in special operations. Because you have a lot of guys that are in reasonably good shape, fairly confident about themselves, going to a lot of faraway lands with a lot of temptation and a lot of opportunity. And I said, I used to get made fun of because I've only ever been with my wife. And guys would, kind of joke about having casual sex. And I said, casual sex, that sounds like it sucks. I get the kind with my wife, which is awesome. So I'm not interested in casual anything. And I only say that because, again, I want people to understand that you're not giving something up by by actually committing to this kind of moral order that God has given. He's actually given you the moral order so that you can more fully embrace and appreciate all of the benefits of marriage as a result. I think I did 4. The 5th one is the professional. Again, guys, if you want to provide, it is important that you continue to develop capabilities so that you can be able to do this. But I want to warn against one thing. I'm not telling you that biblically there's a time or a place that you have to get married or can't. What I'm saying is there are some people that have this idea that what they have to do is build this whole life and then add somebody to it. Now, maybe in some cases that's appropriate. Maybe that's what God's calling to you. Maybe He has different plans. I'm not judging any of that, but I can say there is something so powerful and so incredible about the fact that I know my wife bet on me when I was nothing but potential. And at that point, it probably didn't look like a lot of potential. Right? But I would say 2 things. 1, it made me love her even more. And 2, it drove me. It drove me to be a better husband, a better father, both for Christ and for the wife that He blessed me with and the children that He blessed us with. And maybe, interestingly enough, I'll end with something to the ladies. I really think you're in a room probably full of young men that are actually trying to not only be moral, to not only be capable, to not only be competent, to not only be physically strong. But there is a role that you guys play in our development that cannot be underestimated. Anytime, and there have been times where I was confronted with either difficulties or challenges or danger. I can remember one time in particular where I thought my next move is probably going to get me killed. And that was in Iraq in November of 2008. But I remember in that moment thinking, if I don't do my job right here, regardless of what the cost is, I will not be the man my wife thinks I am. I will not be the father my daughters believe will protect for them no matter what. And I will not be the sort of man I am telling my son he needs to be. So, gentlemen, remember something. The title of being a Christian man is not a bunker you hide in. It is a banner you carry headlong into the fight for everything that you care about, everything that you love, so that everybody knows that no matter what comes, no matter what the challenges, no matter what the temptation, no matter what the danger, you will be there fighting. Not because you hate what's in front of you, but because you love what is behind you.